All right. Good morning, everyone. If you could all take your seats, we'll kick off again to maximise time for this excellent second session. The title of this panel is "What Kind of World Do We Want?" and we'll hopefully be zooming out slightly more to take into account questions of global order, Britain's role more widely, and some broader issues related to British engagement. We have three fantastic panelists. We have to my left Hans Kundnani, Senior Research Fellow in the Europe Programme at Chatham House. And to my right we have Catherine West, a Labour Member of Parliament who was on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and is now Shadow Sports Minister. And then on the far right we have Ambassador Sarah MacIntosh, who is the UK's permanent representative to NATO. Hans, why don't you kick us off? We on the original agenda, we had some questions here about Brexit, the question of whether it represented a sort of fraying of multilateralism, a broader challenge to world order, and how it fit into those bigger questions of the role of Russia in China and the international system. So why don't you give us a broader overview to kick our session off?
Thanks, Shash. What I'd like to try and do in my 5 minutes or so is just talk a little bit about what it seems to me Brexit has to do with the sort of wider crisis of liberal international order that has been much discussed over the last few years. It seems to me that it's sort of routinely seen as being part of this broader crisis. You'll routinely read in the New York Times and the Financial Times and so on this kind of shorthand that kind of includes Brexit as part of this wider sort of populist wave, as it's often described, and in particular often as a sort of a further blow to the liberal international order. This is very much the perception in continental Europe, but also I'm very struck by how this is also the perception in DC, in the sort of foreign policy debate in DC, that Brexit is itself part of this kind of erosion of the liberal international order. On one level, it seems to me that that's a bit misleading. I think that Brexit is somewhat different from Trump, actually. We should differentiate these things. And, you know, clearly Britain, although it is leaving the European Union, it's not leaving NATO, which I think Sarah is going to talk more about. It's not leaving the WTO. So it seems to me actually a little bit misleading to think of Brexit in that way as being part of this kind of erosion of the liberal international order. But it seems to me there is a way in which they are connected, and actually that Brexit is, in a sense, a kind of a sort of reaction against the liberal international order, and in particular, it's this idea of the rules-based international order, which, you know, the foreign policy analysts across the West, it seems to me, in recent decades, have sort of routinely talked about as being inherently a good thing, something that must be defended at all costs. And it seems to me that there is, I say, a way in which Brexit does challenge that. And I think the way to think about it, or at least the way I think about it, is this, that the European Union is, in a sense, the most developed form of the rules-based international order, in which rules, you know, if we think about the development of rules in international politics in the last 30, 40 years, they've gone much, that development of rules has gone much further than it had previously, before the end of the Cold War. But within the European Union, it's gotten even further than it has in the rest of the world in the last 30, 40 years. Now, as I say, the perception, certainly among pro-Europeans, was that this is a good thing, that this kind of thicker version of the liberal international order, the rules-based liberal international order that existed within Europe, was a sort of indication of where the rest of the world should evolve in future, kind of a model really for global governance. But it seems to me that the events of the last sort of 10 years or so in the European Union, particularly within the Eurozone, the Euro crisis, have actually illustrated there's something quite problematic about this development of rules in international politics. And in a sense, they've gone too far. One of the things I think which has been revealed by the Euro crisis in particular is the way that the development of rules in international politics while it was often seen as being a sort of civilizing force that would prevent war and so on, it can also, I think, particularly if it goes too far, undermine democracy. Because essentially what happens in this process of rulemaking in international politics is you take areas of policy, particularly economic policy, out of the space of democratic contestation, and you create rules to govern them, and then insofar as they can be challenged, that's often at the judicial level. The WTO, which I began by mentioning, is a good example of this. And it seems to me there's a sort of wider backlash, not just in Europe against this development of rules, but more broadly at an international level against rules in international politics too. So it seems to me that if we want to save the liberal international order, instead of this reflex that many of us have, which is to sort of uncritically defend it, I think we have to think about reforming the liberal international order. And in particular, I think we need to think more clearly about the role that rules should play in international politics, and whether perhaps in some respects, certainly within the EU, but also beyond the EU, whether they've gone too far and whether they need to be dialed back in some ways. And here, and this connects a little bit with something that Lawrence Freedman said first thing this morning. I mean, you were talking about the sort of end of this era in which Britain and the United States had joint projects. Against the background of this kind of backlash following the global financial crisis and the Iraq war and so on, I do wonder whether actually this could be a new project, is to sort of correct the mistakes that we've made in the last 30, 40 years, which have to a large extent been driven by Britain and the United States. And here I do wonder whether actually Brexit puts Britain in quite kind of an interesting position, which is that we have been forced to engage with this question in the last, three and a half years about how do we get this balance between, on the one hand, openness and deep integration, and on the other hand, sovereignty and democracy. It seems to me this same dilemma is being faced really throughout the West. And we've been forced to think about this in quite an intense way. And I do wonder whether actually, if we can get this right, that actually this could be something that could almost be a model for parts of the rest of the world.
Thanks, Hans. Before I just pass on to Sarah, can I just probe you on one aspect of that so we can spin out your thought completely? If you were sort of advising Sarah sitting in her role at NATO, what does that commitment to a less rigidly rule-bound environment look like in the European security and defence context? What does that translate into in policy terms as to how the UK ought to navigate its way in that area?
I mean, the short answer is I don't know, but it seems to me we need to differentiate between rules in different areas. We need to identify those policy areas where the rules have become a problem. And it seems to me that in particular, that's more in the area of economic policy. So I'm thinking more, as I say, of WTO rules than the security order. I think what's happened in the security order is something slightly different, which is that there were some rules, and actually this again comes back to the sort of period of the doctrine of international community and the Blair speech and so on. I mean, to some extent, we were the ones breaking the rules, actually. And so, and at that time in the 90s, we weren't really too worried about rule breaking because we thought there were more important priorities than that. Now that other non-Western powers are breaking the rules, we're very insistent on, maintaining the rules. I think in practice what has happened, though, is that on these questions around, because really what all of these rules do in different ways is undermine sovereignty, in some good ways and in some bad, some sort of more problematic ways. In terms of military interventions, I think de facto what's happened is we've dialed back in practice already, and we've reverted to the sort of earlier norm, which is that state sovereignty is absolute.
Thanks, Hans. Sarah, you'll look at this from a NATO perspective, but in passing, if you have views on Hans's argument that we are the ones who've broken the rules, and that this is something to bear in mind as we think about how we restructure world order. I mean, be interested in your thoughts on that perhaps as well.
Thanks. Thanks, Shashank. I think probably best if I speak in sort of three areas. First, global Britain, and then the world that Hans described, so what's the plan? The challenges, pick up some of the things he said about the challenges in the international system, and then a bit about what NATO's part is in all of this. So opening the parliamentary debate on global Britain this time last week, the Foreign Secretary set out 3 pillars of a global Britain strategy. The first, ambitious diplomacy and strong relationships. And he was talking about reinvigorating old allies and alliances, forging new friendships with rising economies and powers, and being the best possible friends, allies and partners with our European neighbours as we still share the same interests, the same values and the same benefits of working together on Libya, Iran, Russia, counter-terrorism and so on. Second pillar, to be an energetic champion for free and open trade in the WTO and bilaterally, seeking new agreements with great trading nations, taking opportunities offered by rising economies and working for a trade environment that allows for liberal trade, allows small businesses to flourish and supports global prosperity, and then finding better ways for our development to support global prosperity and sustainable development. And then third being an even stronger force for good in the world. And he describes it, he wants it to be a national mission for us to be a force for good in the world, standing up for our values of freedom and democracy, rule of law and rights, supporting others who try to do the same, calling out and holding to account those who break the rules, and leading on global issues that really matter, like media freedoms, like freedom of religion and conscience, like climate, and leading by example and putting all of our assets to the wheel of moving those forward. And he wants us to do that with confidence and ambition and continuing to be an outward-facing country that blazes a trail with new thinking as we have always done. And to use the integrated review that the government has launched to reassess our position in the world and work out how to do that against the backdrop of the kind of challenges that the international system is facing. I thought I might point to 5 challenges in the system. First, most obviously, states breaking the rules. I guess we will talk about that a bit more. The most obvious examples from where I sit are Russia, Iran, DPRK, and so on. Second, continuing changes to the distribution of wealth and power and a new era of strategic competition. I think about this as being both forward-looking and backward. So forward-looking, there is a new global centre of gravity in the Pacific. The US-China relationship will define the direction of the global economy, of global security, of the environment for the rest of at least my life. But not everyone is looking forward. Some states are looking back. They want to go back from a system based on equality to one based on balance of power or spheres of influence, and so on, neither of which, by the way, worked. And then thirdly, just less power is held by states now. Hans said that states want to return, or some states want to return, to a situation where decision-making is dominated by states, and that's right. But the reality is that states control less of what happens in their borders, within their borders, and from within their borders. We know that we can't tackle climate without energy companies. We know we can't tackle radicalisation without communities. We know we can't tackle online harms without the technology industry. So we can't just operate as state. It has to be in partnership with non-state actors. Fourth big challenge, we're moving from an industrial age to an information age. We know that, we're living it. Most of you are taking notes or not on your phones. But that's going to have some really big impacts, is already having really big impacts for our security. First, it's changing the nature of contest and competition between states in every area. Military superiority now is as much about high technology as it is about tanks and guns, but it's also changing the nature of contest for hearts and minds. So contest has become hybrid and it's become high-tech, and we need to find our way through that. Second, it's changing the economics of conflict. Everything from miniaturization to battlefield resupply to the possibility of the private ownership of the means to wage war. There's no rules in some of these spaces for people to keep or break. And thirdly, it's changing the targets of competition, not just soldiers or combatants anymore, now civilians and our daily way of life. And then the obvious final fifth point about the really long-run change like climate change, urbanization, demographic change and migration and so on. So we talk a lot and think a lot about, in the Foreign Office, about, and in NATO, about Lampedusa moment. If we want things to stay the same, then things need to change, because the world is changing around us. And we've known that for a long time, and we've been responding to it for a long time. That's why we support Security Council reform and voting right reform in the IMF. It's why we joined the IIAB when other countries didn't want to. It's why now we're working for WTO reform and for reform of the International Criminal Court and so on, and why we'll be hosting COP26 later in the year. But I'm the NATO ambassador, so you would expect me to talk a bit about NATO. And my job, my day job, is to pursue NATO's part in all of this, because it's going to be critical. NATO was 70 last year, and it's the most successful alliance in history. The 29, soon to be 30 allies invest about $1 trillion a year to underwrite the defence and security of 1 billion people, and that's a big deal. And NATO enters its 8th decade strong and united. I know it's fashionable to talk about our differences, and we have them, but we are strong and united because NATO adapts when the world changes. So in the 1950s, it was healing the wounds and bringing together free Europe and the Euro-Atlantic. Through the Cold War, standing strong and deterring the Soviet threat. In the 1990s, helping new and newly free states to grow, and then turning wider to peacekeeping, counter-terrorism, and now rebuilding our deterrence and defence for the harder, darker era we are in. And so every day, the things that we do are working together, assessing threats, maintaining deterrence and defence, increasing certainty and managing risk, and helping each other to adapt and plan for the future. And those are the things we do. But the central mission, the reason why we do them, is because we are together in defending our enduring values and in protecting the rights, freedoms, and futures of our people. And we never forget that. And you can be really proud of Britain's contribution, and Shashank's going to stop me talking, so I can't tell you what it is. But if you ask me, I will tell you why you should be really proud of our contribution to NATO. But I will just close with 2 quotes from when NATO was founded. In 1949, when the Washington Treaty was signed, Dwight Eisenhower, NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander, said that NATO was not just about protecting territory, it was about defence of a way of life. And Harry Truman said that NATO was a shield against aggression and fear, a bulwark to permit us to get on with the real business of government and society, which is a fuller and happier life for our citizens. Those were great aims 70 years ago, and they're great aims today. That's the kind of world we want, and we want Britain at the heart of it.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that fantastic overview. Before I move on to Catherine, can I press you on one point? I'm glad you ended on that quote about our way of life. You talked about challenges to a strategic competition, countries that want a balance of power world, states breaking rules, and for NATO, of course, the focus on that is Russia. But at the summit, we also saw very novel language around China. How do you persuade people, and particularly American colleagues, that the UK is serious about those challenges in a Chinese context, and Chinese challenges to our way of life, of course, that are more indirect and less militarised and more diffuse, in light of things like our Huawei decision, but also more broadly, how are we approaching that Chinese aspect of it? And I ask, of course, because this is now a NATO issue. This is not just an issue for your colleagues in Beijing or in London.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to speak to that. So, the relationship that we have with China is, of course, it's broad, it's deep, and it's long standing. But we approach that with a clear-eyed approach that's rooted in our values and interests. So we're pleased to work together in the Security Council over DPRK on health and climate, and you're seeing the results of that this week through the global health situation and coronavirus. We're pleased that trade with China is about £70 billion a year, but we also recognise that China's growth brings challenges, and her increasingly internationalised policy brings challenges, and there are some strains on the rules-based system that need us to engage with China, and that we need to challenge China when we disagree, and we do challenge China when we disagree, for instance, around around freedom of navigation in the South China Seas, around intellectual property rights, around her own defence of human rights. And we're very clear about protecting UK national security and UK nationals and our friends and allies. And that's why the government attributed a cyber attack to a Chinese entity 18 months ago. In NATO, the discussion is really about understanding the implications of China's growth, her rapid acquisition of technology, and her much more international policies. So NATO has no intention of particularly going anywhere closer to China, but China's coming closer to us through Belt and Road, through exercises, through the Polar Silk Road, and so on. So we need to understand what the implications of that are, and how do we persuade our US and other colleagues doing it together.
Thank you. Catherine, I think you're the only elected representatives, oh no, sorry, Tom of course spoke to us in the morning, but you're one of the only elected representatives speaking to us in these panels. So in addition to the way you address the broad themes, I'd be very interested in also your view of, as someone who meets constituents and has to get elected, how do you think public consent for Britain's role in the world is changing? You know, is it getting harder or more difficult to persuade people to be interested in things like China, which may seem more remote or distant from local concerns? But of course you'll address the broader themes as well.
I will. Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I wanted just briefly to touch on the three key points of a good foreign policy, which of course are security and some dialogue around human rights and values, and also speaking about the economics of it all. And of course, we've touched already this morning on the security questions. And of course, just with a little bit more depth, I wanted to mention climate change and the challenges that that presents, because I don't think that's just a sort of a small question. I think that's quite important, and I think that's something which potentially can bring many of us together, regardless of what our security concerns might be. So it could be a good opener for a dialogue with China, for example. Certainly as well on the question of what makes us unsafe, I would like to see a much greater emphasis on talking a little bit, feels a bit retro, but going back to talking about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. I think we've slightly had an empty chair at the table in the last few years, and I think we need to go back to that. I think people do care about that. It's coming back a little bit more in terms of things that people raise with me when they do talk about foreign policy, and that's not all that often. And of course, the other thing is the Brexit question did question what do we believe a good economy looks like. And I think the government's going to be doing some heavy lifting, because really a lot of the Brexit debate is a cri de coeur from regions about we want some more of your attention. We don't want you just sitting down and talking to each other in Whitehall at RUSI meetings. We want you with us in our communities and talking to us about, why we feel we don't have a sense of control or power in our lives, and why we vote in that way, which did surprise many of us. For me, I represent the constituency with the highest number of people who voted to remain in the UK. I also represent the constituency with the highest number of people with a graduate degree, and there are 42,000 EU nationals living in my constituency, in my local government area. So I think I do bring a slightly different perspective than perhaps some of my colleagues, and certainly some of our newer MPs, but I think that the government will have its work cut out to comply with all of the challenges which Sarah has laid out, but also at the same time to meet those high expectations around a large house building agenda, trying to meet the aspirations around some compassion back into the welfare system. Our schools are crying out for funding, both capital and revenue. Disabled children need a lot of attention. There are a lot of domestic priorities which I think will be really challenging. So I think at the same time as trying to think through what the international pressures might be around the WTO and trade and so on, I think there's going to be a real sense of pressure in Parliament to live up to the promises that were made last December. Just to take one example, in terms of the international picture, I represent an area with a lot of Kurdish people. Turkish is one of my main languages spoken in the constituency. And obviously there's real concerns. People do come to my advice surgery and say, we want Kurdish people to feel safe. They felt extremely upset about what happened in Syria in the last 12 months or so and what is ongoing now. And they do want me and other MPs to raise that in Parliament. You know, we can't just forget our responsibilities. We must continue to protect Kurdish people. And that's something which is quite difficult to do when you've got all those domestic things bubbling away. And also in terms of the Foreign Office team, and I'm sure there'll be some interesting announcements made this week as to who will be in Mr Raab's team going forward, but we will have to have a dialogue with Mr Erdogan around human rights, and I think that's going to be quite difficult when at the same time we want to probably sell him quite a lot of arms. So how are we going to sort of square that one? Equally, on the question of refugee and people movement, we all know that Turkey is actually looking after over 3 million refugees, and we also want that to continue and for those refugees eventually to be resettled. So how do we manage that conversation where we have to have several different conversations at the same time? Having a good relationship does matter, but it's not easy to talk about keeping the balance on refugees plus the human rights dialogue for Kurds plus talking about the trade relationship. And I'll be very interested to see as well whether the government opens up some more concessions with countries like Turkey, because there's quite a lot of pent-up demand there in terms of the trade question, because Turkey is one of those economies which has some sense that it could rebound and then enrich that trade relationship. Just to remind everybody, of course, that the no-deal Brexit is still very much a scenario which could happen, and therefore reforming the WTO is quite important. And I'd be very interested to hear from the rest of the panel about what they think, how we engage with the US on the question of making the WTO functional again. Because if we're going to have a no-deal Brexit, then we want to be entering into a WTO which is functional. Currently, I don't believe it is functional because there aren't enough judges to resolve disputes. So I've been quite wide-ranging there, Shashank, but perhaps we could unpick some of those in the questions. But the key is holding the balance between human rights values, what is defence, what should we be concerned about, including the climate change challenge, and finally, how do we maintain domestic happiness and that sense that our own economy can be buoyant again.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Thanks for putting climate change firmly on the agenda for us. And in terms of our panel question, what kind of world do we want? A functional trading system seems a reasonable ask, and we can discuss precisely how we get there. We'll open up to questions. We'll take them in groups of 2 or 3. So Jonathan at the front, and then gentleman in the middle, and then another at the front as well.
Jonathan,
I'm sorry, yeah, please do introduce yourself and give your affiliation. Thanks.
A question to all the panelists about how Britain could continue to influence the debate about security arrangements inside the European Union. It's not a great secret that many countries in the European Union relied on the British in the past to bring the discussion more to sense. That very often the sort of flowery language about what should or could be done was tampered by what Britain was prepared to accept. Now, our voice institutionally is not there. Of course, our voice remains there in a variety of other ways. So it is a bit of speculation, but how much can we continue to influence the European Union debate about defence, and whether we would be able to avoid making the relationship between NATO and the European Union more difficult as a result of us not being in the European Union anymore?
Thank you. Perhaps you could pass the mic on just next door, and you could pass it back.
John Wilson, a member of RUSI and a writer. The title of I see this session says, what kind of a world do we want? And I suppose the short answer is a peaceful one. I was involved considerably in the last general election in December last year, and something that struck me most forcefully was the complete absence of any interest by either the electorate, the media, or politicians in defence. We need to defend ourselves to maintain our standard of living and the values that we have. Are we, because of our lack of interest, likely to go the way of the millions in their contretemps with the Athenians?
Yeah, thank you very much. Ewan Grant, former law enforcement intelligence analyst. I've subsequently worked in a number of choke point countries and Belt and Road countries. I reviewed Tim Marshall's book, Prisoners of Geography, for Chatham House. My question is for all of you, but particularly for Ambassador MacIntosh. China in the UN, China in peacekeeping missions. Any comments about encouraging signs there or alarm bells? Thank you.
Thank you for an admirably succinct question. Okay, I'll start with Hans. Please, the panelists can take on whichever questions they feel most appropriate, but Hans, please kick us off.
Maybe I'll start with the peaceful world lack of interest in defence. I mean, I think this. I mean, Lawrence Friedman, I think, addressed this very eloquently this morning. I mean, it seems to me that you know, Britain's more interested in defence than many other countries. Certainly, many other countries in Europe. I work a lot on Germany, and you know, I mean, Britain is much more interested. Brits are much more willing to spend money on defence than Germans are. But as Lawrence said, I mean, we're in a context in which you have to, I mean, the case for spending money on defence is not as clear as it used to be, it seems to me, and it's quite difficult to make the case. So you know, I think in some ways this is actually quite rational. The way in which people have become a little bit more sceptical about why we're spending the money we do. On security, on how Jonathan's question, how Britain can influence security arrangements in Europe. I think again, for me, it's difficult to detach this from the question about the US role. Because I think my reading of how European defence is going to evolve is that it's going to be largely reactive, reacting to the extent to which the US security guarantee continues or doesn't. I don't think Europeans in general, with the exception of the French, but particularly the Germans, are going to, you know, take radical steps in the direction of strategic autonomy, unless they're absolutely forced to, and I don't think they think they're forced to yet. So it just seems to me difficult to think about what role Britain would play in that, separate from the question about the US involvement. I think there's a very interesting question about if the US were to withdraw more than it currently has been talking about doing. I know somebody is going to say on the ground, you know, actually the US is more committed than it has been at any time in the past. But if the US withdrawal were to materialise, then I think there's a very potentially quite interesting role for Britain in terms of, to some extent at least, stepping into that gap. And what I would advocate, going back to the origins of NATO, I mean, I think it's often forgotten that, you know, the creation of NATO, in which Britain played perhaps the leading role, certainly a leading role, led by Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary. It was a two-step process whereby, you know, it really wasn't clear that the United States was going to be committed to the security of Europe after World War II. But a precondition for the US commitment that subsequently happened through NATO was a British commitment to the security of continental Europe in the Brussels Treaty. And so I wonder whether actually there is a kind of an interesting role for Britain in sort of reinventing NATO, almost, as I say, going back to the spirit of Bevin.
Thank you, Hans. Catherine.
Thank you. On the European question, of course, we mustn't forget that, you know, we still haven't got an agreement on our security arrangements with Europe. I mean, I think we all think Brexit's done. Don't believe the spin. We still have to negotiate all that. Now, of course, we've got a very strong position because actually, as you said, the Europeans want to share the expertise that we have. But we saw with the Huawei decision just how difficult that sometimes is. Because a lot of our partners didn't want us to go down the route of 35% arrangement with the Chinese over Huawei. So I think it's actually quite a difficult question about where we're going to position ourselves, and I think that's why today's session is so important, because we do have to start influencing which way we want to go. But as a very strong European, I feel that we need to stick as close as we can to that strength, that cultural and that values-based strength. And I think part of the reason that we don't talk about defence as much is that we've forgotten. And I often find it interesting that it's the older generation, 80 plus, who speak to me about the war and peace issues. And if anyone's seen 1917 over the weekend, they'll know why. They just to remember that pain. And anyone who's backpacked around Europe will see it's full of graveyards. And I think it's just about remembering our past and teaching history and remembering the pain that we've been through. And really, any defence is just about networks, friends, and sticking close together so that we can influence and keep at bay the forces that wish us harm. It's quite simple.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thanks. And I suppose just to pick first on the China question, to agree with Catherine, peacekeeping is about keeping people as safe as they can in the toughest situations in the world, and countries who want to join that and do it efficiently and effectively, consistent with the values of the United Nations, are welcome. And there is a sad but real ongoing need to do that. I thought I'd probably better pick up Jonathan's questions about influencing in foreign policy going forward and the NATO-EU relationship. And the first obvious thing to say is that the UK and the EU, as sort of sovereign equals going forward, will continue to face the same threats. We live in the same area, we face the same neighbourhood, we face the same challenges in the international system, and we continue to share the same values. That's just a sort of fact of life. And it didn't change on the 31st of January. The ways that we will continue to engage in European security and continue to play a leading role in it are many. I mean, we will obviously remain, as the UK, a leading player in European security, drawn very widely, and we will do that in our bilateral relationships. We will continue to talk with our European neighbours through embassies, through our defence engagement and our defence attachés network. They will come here to London, we will go out to them. We will continue to talk with them in Brussels on the EU side of town. Our United Kingdom representation to the European Union is now the United Kingdom mission to the European Union, but it still wants to talk with the European Union member states about foreign policy, security policy, domestic policy. We continue to talk to 21 NATO allies who are also European Union member states in NATO every day. We will continue to exchange information where that's in everybody's interest. We will continue to have new ideas and to do thought leadership. That's one of the things that the UK is really good at, and people are interested in our ideas, and we still continue to have them, and we intend to continue to have them. So we'll keep talking about that, and we'll continue to work through small groups, and not only bilateral but trilateral, quadrilateral and other arrangements, as we always have. So later this week, NATO defence ministers will all meet in Brussels, and one of the things that the Defence Secretary will be doing on behalf of the United Kingdom is signing a memorandum of understanding on readiness with our JEF partners, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is 9 countries that have chosen to work together. We're also part of the Northern Group. We work with France and Germany as part of the E3. He's going to engage during that meeting in a meeting with the V4 countries from Central Europe. So all of that is part of normal routine diplomatic business, and we're engaging in it with enthusiasm and determination, as you would expect. On the NATO-EU relationship, There are 74, if you can believe, lines of work between NATO and the European Union, of which some of the very important ones are around military mobility. That's enabling large numbers of reinforcement forces to move rapidly towards and through Europe, which is a little bit about roads and a little bit about customs checkpoints and dip clear and those kinds of things. There is counter-terrorism work. There is work to counter hybrid threats, work on cyber security, work on women, peace and security. So across the agendas of both organisations, and that work will continue. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg met with Josep Borrell 3 weeks ago, I don't remember exactly, and they have pledged to keep working together, and that certainly is our approach, that the closer the organisations work, the better that is. And keeping the US part of NATO, I'm going to be the person who says, actually, the US continues to contribute an enormous amount to Europe. The European Deterrence Initiative, which is the US initiative that focuses on deterrence in Europe, will invest $6.5 billion this year. That's a lot of money in anybody's world. So I don't think the US are planning to withdraw from Europe. I sit next to the US ambassador every day, and she sounds to me very committed to Europe.
Although it's symbolic that, of course, the European Deterrence Initiative has had its funding slashed because of diversion to the border wall, which sort of neatly ties together the populist moment in America, the impact on alliances, and although, yes, there is this enormous financial commitment, you know, it's now plateaued and money is going down and it's being put over to one of Trump's pet projects. But, Hans, you got a very brief comment.
Well, yeah, I feel I have to challenge this idea that, you know, in NATO we share values and interests. I just don't think this is true. I mean, we now have authoritarian states in NATO, competitive authoritarian states, but nevertheless authoritarian states. And I think this is a real problem. The way I think of the history of NATO is that during the Cold War period, what the glue that held NATO together was a shared threat perception from the Soviet Union. And certainly in the early period of the Cold War, there were authoritarian states in NATO too. It wasn't an alliance that was bound by shared values. It was bound together by shared threat perception. Then in the post-Cold War period, after the Soviet threat disappears, NATO tries to reinvent itself as a community of values, basically an alliance of democracies. Precisely because there wasn't any more shared threat perceptions, it seems to me now we're in a situation where there's neither shared interests because we don't have agreement about what the threats are. That's precisely what the, you know, Macron brain dead comments are all about. It's precisely what Trump is talking about when he says that, you know, NATO is obsolete because it's not meeting 21st century threats rather than 20th century threats. But at the same time, as no longer having shared interests, we also no longer have shared values because once again we have authoritarian states within NATO. So I have to say this makes me rather pessimistic about the future of NATO, in particular because it also connects with the discussion we were having a minute ago about public support, which Catherine was talking about too. Part of the reason it seems to me it's quite difficult to justify defence spending is that we are in an alliance with countries we no longer share values with. This is certainly a problem in Germany. It's part of why Germans are so reluctant to spend more money on defence. But I think it's also further down the line potentially a problem in Britain.
Do you want a 10-second comment in return, Sarah? You don't have to exercise that right. But
well, all I would say is I don't agree. And what I would say is, look, NATO allies don't agree on everything. We know that. But they never have. There have been many moments in history when NATO allies have not agreed on every point on their agendas. When Turkey invaded Cyprus, during Suez, during the Iraq War in 2003. You know, now we don't agree on everything. We don't agree on climate change. We don't agree on the JCPOA in Iran. You know, we don't. But we don't need to agree on everything. What we need to do is unite in our common defence and security. And that's what we do, and we do it every day.
Let's throw it back out to the floor. Okay, so one at the front. Anyone from the back? Yep, lady over there. So perhaps if you start here, and then we can go there. And anyone, third person? No.
Thank you very much. Keith Best, Secretary of the European Movement. Question on arms and NATO. Catherine, you mentioned Turkey. How dangerous is Turkey, a member of NATO, taking arms from Russia and also the rapport between Erdogan and Putin. How dangerous is that to NATO? And also on arms sales, should we continue to sell arms to places like Turkey and Saudi Arabia with dodgy human rights records on the basis that if we don't sell them, somebody else will, and if we don't sell them, it will damage our domestic industries? Or can we afford to take a more principled stand?
Okay, over there. If anyone wants a third questioner, please catch my eye in the next minute.
Annabelle Turner, Defence Analyst at DSTL. Slight change of topic. We've had a lot of discussion about prosperity, research, investment in technology, etc., and the issue of climate change. I was just wondering, as defence is a huge consumer of energy and emitter of emissions, whether there's been any sort of serious debate about defence's role in addressing the issues of climate change.
Thank you. Malcolm at the front, and then there was someone at the back, if I can just take the last two briefly.
Well, I just wanted to build on something that Hans said in relation to the difficulties in creating a narrative for this review which accords with reality. And certainly in the Prime Minister's speech last week, he had this marvellous metaphor of Clark Kent emerging from the phone box as Superman, leading the world towards free trade, and even making allowance for his style. To make free trade the leading element of a foreign policy when you're withdrawing from the European Union and taking back control of national regulation with the cost that involves in terms of reducing free trade. There's a paradox there which I don't think has been explained. But then I think that does then say, well, what is the new narrative consistent with a low alignment Brexit? And I think it relates also to what Laurie was saying earlier, that we're reluctant to be a rule taker, but we will continue to be a crisis taker. But we will also, I think, be a trend taker. There's a lot happening in the world, not least in the US-China relationship, which will have fundamental implications for the nature of the world trading system going forward, where we're largely bystanders. How that relationship going, we may have some influence at the margin, we're largely bystanders, but we will have to respond to it. So my question really is, do we have a narrative for our foreign policy in a world in which it feels as if globalization is being significantly pulled back, most of all in Europe, but also more broadly?
Thanks, Malcolm. And the last one, just back briefly, please.
Josh Arnold-Forster. Just to continue the theme that Malcolm raised about trade and about free trade. One of the more interesting aspects of the PM speech was his reference to Adam Smith, Ricardo and Cobden. And he said the best way to make peace is to do lots more trade. And we've seen that theme in British foreign policy for about 100 years. Building on the work of Immanuel Kant, etc., etc., etc. And we've also seen consistently that it is a highly debatable proposition. Why do we think? Do we think this government is seriously committed to this ideology, and do we think he'll be any more successful going forward?
And it's striking that we should, in disconnect to Malcolm's point, go down that road in a moment in which US overarching strategy is dominated by the idea of trade as a part of the arena of ruthless competition and domination of global technology supply chains. And that accentuates, I think, the intellectual gulf with our most important ally. Hans, again. Oh, sorry, can we take this the other way around? Sorry. Sarah, could you start this time, and we'll go this way, perhaps, if that's all right?
Yes. So defence role in climate change, yes, there is a serious discussion. The Ministry of Defence has a strategy for greening defence. NATO has a strategy for greening defence, and it relates to exactly the elements you would expect it to do around the carbon footprint, around the estates, around the technologies that they use and the way that things are organised. On Turkey, what I would say is There are some challenges in the relationship with Turkey, and we have a strong enough relationship with Turkey to raise those challenges. In the context in which I work, the ones that we see most often are around the S-400, which is part of the question. It's an air defence system that Turkey is buying from Russia, which we regret and have made clear our view on that, and operations in Syria and Libya. But I would just also want to be really clear that that Turkey is a very important ally in NATO. Not only is she our southern border with a part of the world from which a number of threats to NATO and to the United Kingdom originate or pass through. She's the host of a number of important NATO facilities, including the Land Command headquarters at Izmir, a counter-terrorism centre, she's a forward operating base for AWACS, she's a dual-capable aircraft nation. That means she's part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. She invests in her own defence and takes her Article 3 self-help commitments very seriously, as all NATO allies should, and she contributes forces to every single NATO operation. So do we agree on everything? No, but Turkey is an important NATO ally. And I think, Malcolm, I'm not sure you were asking me, I think maybe you were asking Hans, but I think narrative for foreign policy is global Britain, force for free trade, force for good.
Catherine.
Thank you. On the question of the sale of arms, what I would like to see within Parliament is a proper committee to scrutinise the work of the department which gives licences to exporters. I think at least we would then know what we're dealing with. At the moment, the committee doesn't meet very regularly. It's a subcommittee of other committees and so on, and I would like to see that have its own committee so at least we know when we can be critical without being vague. And I think that's the least we can expect in Parliament with a large majority government. The second thing I wanted to say was on the free trade, definition of free trade and so on. I mean, what are we talking? Going back to tobacco concessions with Iran or the opium wars with China? This is why there's that level of suspicion with other countries around. That what does trade mean, and what's the definition of it? And I think perhaps the Prime Minister was being, and I'm allowed to say this as opposed to probably everybody else as an opposition MP, but I think it's just the opening kind of gambit around the EU relationship, because I think the more that the government says this is about free trade, the more the EU will think it has to come towards the UK. That's my view, but who knows? I don't write the speeches, Mr Cummings does.
Perhaps you on one aspect of
Yes.
that as well. In the US political debates, the left of American politics, I mean, as well as the right, has also soured on the idea of open trade as an animating intellectual idea, and we see this very clearly in Democratic Party and even in sort of Hillary Clinton's campaign to some extent, in her own late souring on the TPP. What does it look like here in terms of a sort of partisan divide in the left of British politics? What are the sort of dominant currents on thinking on trade and open trade?
I think there's not a big knowledge base amongst your average MP about trade, and I think we're all feeling our way a bit.
And yet it's a sort of the central organising theme of
and it very much
foreign policy.
Plays to the concept of taking back control. But I think where perhaps Mr Trump and also our own government sometimes isn't very honest is a deal, which means you lose something in order to gain something. It's still, we get everything because we're the best. And actually we all know, if you speak to US farmers, soy farmers and all sorts of other stakeholders, they are having a terrible time, but we never hear that. We've just heard from the FT over the weekend, the jobs total's gone up. It's always spinning it to the positive, which you do, but I think we have to realise that with any arrangement, whether it's with the EU, whether it's with the free trade, somebody is going to lose out. And I feel that often politicians, I'm sure my own side as well, we're just not honest about the fact that whichever decision you take, whichever way you go, there's going to be losers. And there are plenty of those in the US, so I'll be very interested in what happens with the US election.
Thank you very much. Hans.
So let me try and link these two really interesting questions about free trade. I agree with you, Malcolm. There's something, you said paradoxical, I would say absurd about the Boris Johnson kind of idea of, free trade as this kind of banner for British foreign policy. Not just because, as you were suggesting, there's something odd about doing this at a moment when we're taking, what on the surface is at least a sort of anti-free trade step by leaving the European Union, but also because I just think it absurdly idealises the idea of free trade. You know, this is a British ideology going back to the repeal of the Corn Laws, but you know, we ought to know better by now. Partly because of what Catherine has said, we know that free trade creates winners and losers. We know that often it can create instability. We also know, to come to your question, that it doesn't prevent war. We know this since 1914, surely. And I think that was the end of the first era of globalization. So I think that basically what's happened is we've forgotten the lessons of the first era of globalization, and we're having now to relearn them. At the end of the post-Cold War in particular, we sort of embraced free trade as a kind of a concept in roughly the same way that we did it, you know, in the 19th century. And I think now we're sort of reaching the end of the road with that. And I think this is kind of what I was driving at in my opening remarks. Brexit is a sort of partly a manifestation of that. So I think instead of, at a moment when we're doing Brexit, saying, well, we believe in free trade, I think we should own this a bit more and say, look, you know, Brexit has revealed some of the problems with this liberal ideology, particularly this economic liberal ideology that has dominated for the last 30, 40 years. We have now been forced to correct that. The US is going through something somewhat analogous. You know, actually, I think what we should be doing is sort of owning that, and you know, if we're looking for a narrative, I think what the narrative should be is not free trade, force for free trade, force for good. It's something about fixing hyperglobalization. That's precisely what I was trying to get at with, you know, at the beginning, was to say, look, maybe Britain is in quite a good position to fix hyperglobalization. It strikes me that we do have this kind of long ideology of free trade and of openness going all the way back to, you know, as I say, the repeal of the Corn Laws. At the same time, we have quite a highly developed sense of national sovereignty and popular sovereignty. And fixing hyperglobalization, it seems to me, is precisely about getting the balance between those two things. So I think Britain is in kind of uniquely well positioned, actually, to recalibrate hyperglobalization and find a new balance between, on the one hand, openness and deep integration, and on the other hand, sovereignty and democracy and control. And just finally, on the question, I can't remember who asked it, about defence and climate change, I don't have an answer to it, but my colleague Tom Rains, who's sitting in the audience, does. So talk to him.
Great. Thank you very much, Hans. Before we just thank the panelists, just a closing thought. It's interesting to think about what doesn't come up as prominently as it would have done some years ago, particularly the diminishing role of non-state actors, violent extremism, counter-terrorism. In many ways, the agenda has shifted to strategic economic issues and strategic competition with bigger powers, and that's very clear from the balance of our substantive remarks. It's also very interesting to think about how our debate here differs from one that could be held amongst a representative group in Washington or in Brussels. In Brussels, of course, we'd hear a lot more about strategic sovereignty, European sovereignty, about Europe protecting its common borders. Emmanuel Macron gave a speech on nuclear deterrence on Thursday, which touched on many of the same themes he has in the past, including on resolutely focusing on European sovereignty in strategic technology, which for him, of course, includes things like telecoms and 5G. And in Washington, as we already mentioned, it would be a debate focused on great power competition with Russia and China, and really mostly about China. It would be, an American official would not open remarks by saying that there's a great deal to value in the US-China relationship, and but there are things to be concerned about. They would say China's a threat to America's way of life and America's security, and that we will compete with it everywhere in the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific. And that sense of intellectual divergence from both of these big blocks, I think, is evident in our priorities and the way our discussion has gone. In the American context, Huawei could be an interesting example of somewhere we are somewhat detached from both of those, depending on how the EU proceeds on these questions, and an interesting test. But the other big standout is we returned again and really focused on the economic theme and trade. And it's fascinating, I think, to reflect on what that will mean for our security and defence relationships, and which ones will be subordinate. Thank you all for fantastic remarks, and if you could please join me in thanking our panel for their very thoughtful presentations. Thank you. Yes, it will.